Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the appeal of wisdom in the book of Proverbs. That will be the first 9 chapters in our continuing study of the poetic books of the Old Testament. Last time we saw this brief outline. It starts off chapters 1 through 9, the appeal of wisdom. That's where we're going to be in this section. Next we'll be seeing beginning the Proverbs themselves begin in chapter 10 with a series of one-verse maxims. It begins with the Proverbs of Solomon. Halfway through about chapter 25 we have the Proverbs that are collected by the men of Hezekiah. And then the last 2 chapters are the words of Agur, those are larger couplets, and then the words of King Lemuel, followed by the description of the good, or I like to call her the valiant woman. Proverbs chapter 1 verse 8, then we just had that introduction where it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Hear, my son, your father's instructions, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are a graceful wreath to your head, and ornaments about your neck." Notice, don't forget your mother's instruction, her teaching, her Torah. Normally we translate that law, but it also has that idea of the teaching. And here's some of that teaching. "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, 'Come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole as they go down to the pit.'" In other words, we're planning bad things against somebody. They're saying we'll find all kinds of precious wealth. We'll fill our houses with spoil. We'll, just throw in your lot with us. We'll all have one purse. Team up with some bad people. Do some bad things to make some good money. "My son, if they do that, my son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your feet from their path, for their feet run to evil, and they hasten to shed blood. Indeed, it is useless to spread the baited net in the sight of any bird." That's almost like a proverb unto itself. If you put a trap where a bird can see it, bird probably is smart enough to avoid that trap. But they set a trap for themselves. They lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who gains by violence. It takes away the life of its possessor. Don't go building a trap into which you're going to fall. Now, that's the enticement of sinners, verses 10 through 19, but that's going to be contrasted now with the appeal of wisdom. So there's an appeal, a bad appeal first, don't go there, and then the appeal of wisdom. This is the appeal you want to listen to. Wisdom, here's her appeal. Wisdom shouts in the streets. And it's interesting when it says wisdom shouts. Notice we translated it with a singular, but actually the first line is plural. The wisdoms, plural, they shout, but then it's going to return to the singular. "She lifts her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy streets she cries out. At the entrance of the gates in the city she utters her sayings." Here's her sayings. "How long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing, and fools hate knowledge. Turn to my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you." Wisdom is calling that. "Because I called, and you refused. I stretched out my hand, and no one paid attention. And you neglected all my counsel, and did not want my reproof." Wisdom called, and no one picked up. Nobody answered. Wisdom goes on to say, "I will also laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your dread comes. When your dread comes like a storm, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind. When distress and anguish come upon you. Then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord." Remember how we started? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom, but they didn't choose that route. And so, once you're in the trap, once your life has been shattered, it's a little bit late to be looking now for wisdom. It reminds us of the words of Jesus. Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 and 25. "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. The next few verses say, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act upon them. Notice, it's not just hearing. You can hear all the wisdom in the world. It's not hearing that does anything, but it's acting on that wisdom. Jesus said, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rains fell, the floods came, the winds blew, slammed against it, that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. And the implication, the lesson is, you don't want your life to be like that house. You want to build your house. You want to live your life listening to the words of wisdom. So here in chapter 1, wisdom calls out for the reader to come. First of all, as it said, don't follow that bad calling, follow the good calling of wisdom. And now in chapter 2, the reader is told to search out wisdom. Wisdom came calling, but now go look for that wisdom. So chapter 2, verse 1, my son, if you will receive my words and treasure my commandments within you, here it is, make your ear attentive to wisdom. Incline your heart to understanding. For if you cry out for discernment, if you lift your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures, then you will discover the fear of the Lord. Remember, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And you'll discover the knowledge of God. But you need to be ready to look for it. Verse 6, for the Lord does give wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He's a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice, and he preserves the way of his godly ones. Verse 20, we jump down to verse 21, for the upright will live in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be uprooted. Notice there is a moral quality to wisdom. It's not just being smart, but to have that skill of living, I need to look for the way that's upright and not wicked, not treacherous. Now we come to chapter 3, and the call is to trust in the Lord. So, chapter 3, verse 1, my son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For a length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Sounds a little bit like when God says, honor your father and mother. And that's the first commandment with the promise. Here is a promise as well. Verse 3, do not let kindness and truth leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart, so that you will find favor and good repute in the sight of God and man. Verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Now, when we talk about making paths straight, a little disclaimer here. Sometimes we think, you're going to have a nice 4-lane highway or a sidewalk. We have those in my neighborhood. But this is written in the ancient world. This wasn't written in my neighborhood in South Florida. This is written in the ancient world, and a straight path might have been a path. Yes, there were rocks, and yes, there were twists and turns, but you could still find the path. So remember, imagine a desert, a path in the desert, a path that you can follow, but this isn't, modern-day sidewalks. It doesn't mean you're never going to run into problems. They will be there on occasion, but you can still follow the Lord, and you can use wisdom. So he says in verse 7, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. And notice, a fear of the Lord, it's both wise, but it's also healthy. It's healthy to fear the Lord. Verse 9, honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all your produce. Again, how you treat the Lord, that's the beginning of wisdom. So your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine. And God blesses those who honor him. He honors them. And you say, wait a minute, I remember the book of Job. What happened there? Well, we're going to get to that. That's the question that we ask now. Are the Proverbs promises, or are they probabilities? Are they promises, or are they principles? And I've sort of gone both ways on this. I like the way that Bruce Walke, he claims that, well, they're promises, but no single proverb contains all the truth, and they must all be taken and weighed together. And that's a good point. That whether they're promises or principles or probabilities, that we have to take all of them. You can't just take one proverb and try to make it tell the whole story. It doesn't. Even in our modern day proverbs, for example, we have a proverb that says, the pen is mightier than the sword. What we mean by that, there's power in the written word, in words that are put to paper, and they can accomplish great things. And yet we have a corresponding proverb that says, actions speak louder than words. Now, which is true? Well, they both make a point. They both make a true and valid point, even though they are in contrast to one another. Another familiar proverb, you're never too old to learn. And as an old guy, I can say, well, that's true. You can still learn new things. And yet, there's another proverb corresponds to that. It's polar opposite. It says you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I like the way Howard Hendricks used to say, well, that's true if you're teaching dogs their tricks, but we're not. But the proverb actually tells us something that is true, that it is difficult to learn when you're sort of set in your ways and you're old. And so both proverbs actually tell a real truth, make a real point. Now, the Proverbs themselves do this, and here's two Proverbs that are side by side. Proverbs 26:4, do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be like him. And then the very next verse, Proverbs 26:5, answer a fool as his folly deserves, that he not be wise in his own eyes. Well, which is it? Do you not answer the fool? Do you answer the fool? Wisdom is knowing the difference, knowing which to apply at what time. There are times when you should not answer a fool, because you're just going to get swept into his silly arguments. There's times when you need to put a fool in his place, especially that he might not pull others down to his level. Here's another one. Now, these aren't going to be side by side. Proverbs 17:9, he who conceals a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates intimate friends. And contrast that with Proverbs 28:23, he who rebukes a man will afterward find more favor than he who flatters with the tongue. Well, do you conceal a transgression, or you point it out to that person? Now, I don't think these are really, and they're not, they're not pitting one against the other. They're different situations, and yet they sound like polar opposites. Now, there's also what I want to describe as descriptive proverbs. These describe a situation in life without commenting on whether it is good or it is bad. They're just saying this is the way life is. For example, one descriptive proverb is Proverbs 17:8. A bribe is a charm in the sight of its owner. Wherever he turns, he prospers. Now, that's not saying so go out and bribe your government officials or start giving bribes. It's not saying that. It's just describing a truth. It is true that bribes take place because so very often they work, at least on the short term, at least in the sight of its owner. That doesn't mean you should go out and start giving bribes away. I think that's not a good thing. But there's other proverbs that are going to deal with that are going to deal with ill-gotten gains. Another descriptive proverb, Proverbs chapter 14, verse 20, the poor is hated even by his neighbor, but those who love the rich are many. Now, it's not saying that it ought to be like that. It's just saying life is like that. You notice somebody wins the lottery, and all of a sudden he's got friends, neighbors, and even relatives that he didn't even know about. And yet the poor person is so often ignored. Now, I believe that the Proverbs are presented in the Scriptures as a creation ordinance. I said that it's not going to be underscored by covenants or thus saith the Lord, and yet God made the creation in such a way that certain things take place, I guess we could say naturally or supernaturally, but everything is supernatural because it's a universe that God supernaturally made. So, for example, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 19 and following, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding he established the heavens. By his knowledge the deeps were broken up and the skies drip with dew. My son, Verse 21, my son, let them not vanish from your sight. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, so they will be life to your soul and adornment to your neck. The reason that you should observe the Proverbs, one reason, is because God made the world where it works a certain way. So read the instruction manual, read how life works, and you will be much better for having learned that. Then you will walk in your way securely, and your foot will not stumble. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Do not be afraid of sudden fear, nor of the onslaught of the wicked when it comes, for the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being caught. Not going to say you're never going to have problems, but he will see you through them as you're confident. Now, the Proverbs also talk, and we're going to be closing on this note, the Proverbs talk about loves of the heart. So, Proverbs chapter 4, verse 20, my son, give attention to my words. Incline your ear to my sayings. Do not let them depart from your sight, but keep them in the midst of your heart. Keep the Proverbs close to your heart. He goes on to say, for they are life to those who find them, and health to all their body. So that you ought to watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flows the springs of life. On what do you have your heart? Do you have your heart set on the Lord? He calls you to do that. He calls you to trust in Him, and He calls you to love Him with all your soul, with all your heart, with all your might.